undertaken. We've been working on it for months here, and it's been very difficult not sharing it with the world until now, because we're all so passionate about it. So the easiest way to get into it is just to describe its origin. So Bishop, the whole Catholic Church has gone through this lacerating sexual abuse scandal that has undermined and harmed the church in basically every one of its dimensions. Anybody watching this knows what I'm talking about, from the revelations of then Cardinal McCarrick to the Pennsylvania grand jury report to numerous sexual abuse revelations that have come out since then. The church has just been spiraling into near despair. And so in light of that, you sat down and you wrote a new book. This is a book titled Letter to a Suffering Church. If you're watching the video version, you'll see a picture of it here on the screen. Letter to a Suffering Church, a Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. It's about 125 pages, so it's fairly lengthy, but you could still read the whole thing in maybe an hour, hour and a half. And we're going to talk about this book throughout the rest of the episode. But before we do, I wanted to highlight a couple of key facts about this book. So our goal is to get this book out to as many Catholics as possible. And to do that, we're trying to make it as cost-effective as possible so as many people can get it as we can help them. So here's the deal. If you go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter, wordonfireshow.com/letter, you can get one copy of the book for free as long as you cover the shipping and handling. This is only for U.S. residents. If you're an international resident, you'll go to that site and you'll find out how you can get a digital version. But for U.S. residents, go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free print copy of the book as long as you cover the shipping. But here's the better part. If you are in a parish or in a larger small group, if you order 20 or more copies, you get the books for just $1 a copy with free shipping. $1 a copy with free shipping. So for 20 books, it's about $20. 100 books, about $100, and so on and so forth. So we encourage you to get these books for your parish and pass them out. If you're a pastor, a priest, a parish staff member, get this book for every person in their parish to give them hope, encouragement, and edification. I'll talk a little bit later in the podcast about all the extra resources we're giving you to make this effective. For example, a parish launch kit to help you launch this into your parish, an FAQ guide for priests and pastoral staff, and a 5-part video series from Bishop Barron that goes along with the book. So this is just the introductory announcement to get your book now. wordonfireshow.com/letter. Okay, Bishop, I want to spend the rest of this episode talking about what's in this book because it's just launching today, Monday, May 13th. Few people know about it yet, so I wanted to give people an overview of what's inside. So in the preface, you begin by saying, I'm not speaking in the name of my brother bishops or the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops or the Vatican. I have no authority to do so. I'm speaking in my own name as a Catholic, a priest, and a bishop. You also describe the book as a cry from the heart. It's not just sort of a bland, hollow, administrative statement. It's a real cry from your own heart. So what moved you? What compelled you to write this book in this style?
Yeah, I think, Brandon, it goes back to last summer when you and I sat down. Remember, I just was back from Ireland, and we did 2 videos on this whole issue. And those videos were really kind of a cri de coeur, as the French say, a cry from the heart. And they got a very strong reaction from people. And I think you and I began talking at that stage about maybe getting those in some kind of print form. So it's been percolating for a while. And what I wanted to do was write. It's a book, as you've been saying correctly. And actually, I haven't even seen the final version, the number of pages. But it's really a letter. And that's what it's called, a letter to a suffering church. I want it to be something that's substantive, but can be read, in 1 or 2 sittings maybe. But it was coming, you're right, out of my kind of pastoral heart. As I say there, I have no authority. I'm not speaking for the bishops. I mean, I don't have that authority. I'm not speaking for the Vatican. This is not any kind of official statement. It's simply my statement. But coming, I would say, out of, my whole life as a Catholic, 33 years as a priest, now almost 4 years as a bishop. This crisis has been, and I like that word you use, I think it was Cardinal DiNardo used it first, lacerating. It's been lacerating for the whole church, but for those of us in pastoral ministry, it has been. And it was just my pastor's heart, I think, that wanted to say something to the people of God. And the target audience of this book, even though I'm happy if non-Catholics, listen in, but the target audience is Catholics. And the image I have, Brandon, is in the wake of the McCarrick scandals last summer and fall, the number of times in my region out here in Santa Barbara, I'd go around to parishes and there I'd stand with my, mitre and crosier, and I'm fully symbolizing the church. The number of people that came up to me, not so much in anger, but in deep grief, I would say, with tears in their eyes, grief over the church. And the book, the letter, is my attempt to respond to that pastoral need. So it's no more, no less than that, I would say. I don't want people to read it as, oh, this is the official statement of the American bishops. Nothing of the kind. I mean, I don't have authority to do that. But it's from my own pastor's heart, I would say.
I know all of us at Word on Fire were deeply concerned when this new survey came out from Gallup, one of the largest religious sociological groups in the country. And it revealed that 37% of American Catholics, 37% of Americans who identify as Catholic, who say I'm Catholic, have considered leaving the church as a result of these sexual abuse revelations. Now, they go deeper and that number changes depending on how often you go to mass, predictably, all that kind of stuff. But the simple fact that almost 40% of our own people are sitting on the fence and they're thinking, maybe I should go, maybe I should stay. It seems like those are the people that you want to draw back to the church.
Yeah. I mean, I got it when I read that survey. I got it, but it broke my heart at the same time. I say it bluntly in the book. There's never a good reason to leave the Catholic Church. Now, again, I understand emotionally. I understand why people feel deep frustration. I feel it. But there's never a good reason to absent oneself from the font of grace. I mean, to leave the mystical body of Jesus. There's never a good reason for that. I don't care how badly church people behave. I don't care how grave the sin is on the part of church people. There's never a good reason to leave. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to make that case, is to say that, yes, this exists, this terrible, lacerating crisis. Yes, we have to be absolutely clear-eyed about it. But no, it's never a legitimate reason for leaving the church. In some ways, the book turns on those two hinges, I think.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. Bishop Barron just released this book today. You can get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free copy mailed to you as long as you cover the shipping, or you can buy bulk copies for your whole parish or your group for just $1 a copy with free shipping. So wordonfireshow.com/letter. Bishop, the book has 5 chapters, and I want to spend time talking about...
Before we start, Brandon, can I just say a word? Because, yes, we want this book to get out. I want it to be widely read, but, we've been very strong on this, that we're not making a penny of money on this book. We're trying to make it, first of all, as available as possible, right? As cheaply as possible. We've done that through various means. But secondly, any profit that might be derived from the sale of this book is going to go automatically, immediately into charities dedicated to helping victims of sexual abuse. And I just want people to be really clear about that, because the last thing in the world we wanted to do was give the impression that we're, trying to make money off of this terrible time in the church. The goal is simply to get it out to as many people as possible.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks. Also, anybody who knows anything about printing and shipping books knows that if you offer a book for $1 a copy, that's far less than it costs to print and ship books out. So we've also been helped by generous donors who have helped get the cost down, because they believe in this mission of getting the book out through parishes to as many people as possible. Good. Okay, well, before we dive into each of these 5 chapters, one more question. What do you think sets this book apart from other statements about the abuse crisis? And I don't just mean from other bishops, but multiple journalists and stories and articles and books and blogs, have covered the abuse crisis from so many angles. What sets your book apart?
Well, what I always found, Brandon, was missing in so many of the accounts, and as indispensable as they are, so don't get me wrong, that we analyze this thing from a sociological, cultural, psychological, legal standpoint, all that remains indispensably valuable. But what I often found missing was a theological and spiritual and biblical reading of this crisis. And maybe if I could say one of the original elements in this book is the section where I go into the Bible and how the Bible sheds considerable light on this problem of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. But I'm trying to read it from a consistently spiritual and theological standpoint without eschewing for a minute those other points of view, but that's not my focus. And I think that's the novelty of this book.
All right, so let's go through each of the 5 chapters in the book, Letter to a Suffering Church. Chapter 1 is titled The Devil's Masterpiece. What do you talk about there?
That's a phrase I used, I think, when we had those videos, right, last summer. I might have used that phrase kind of spontaneously, a diabolical masterpiece, because I don't think it's possible to read this crisis simply from a natural or purely human standpoint. To me, in its destructiveness, in its comprehensiveness, it's just too well thought through. I've often said, if you were trying to find the best way to undermine the church in every aspect of its life, I challenge you to come up with a better plan than this one. I just don't think an appeal to the purely natural is sufficient to account for how devastatingly destructive this has been. And I've been, very influenced too by the Pope's insistence that we read this thing spiritually. The devil is described as the enemy of the human race, but more specifically, the enemy of the church. I mean, the devil hates the church because the church is trying to bring people to Christ. If you're this very powerful and deeply intelligent spiritual being, what are you going to come up with? It seems to me this crisis has been a diabolical masterpiece. It's a masterwork of wicked undermining of the church's life. So I begin with that observation. Now, I'm very quick to point out, because anticipating sort of dualistic critiques. The minute you invoke the devil, people say, "Oh, well, isn't that convenient? The devil did it, and we have nothing to do with it." Well, of course not. I mean, of course not. There's a kind of it's a perverse simulacrum of the way we cooperate with God's grace, right? God's grace awakens our cooperation. Well, in a similar way, it's a perverse simulacrum, but the devil calls forth our cooperation, and he does so typically through insinuation, through temptation, through suggestion, etc. And I use the example of the wonderful fresco of the Antichrist in Orvieto, Luca Signorelli's masterpiece of the devil putting his arm through the vesture of the Antichrist in such a way that it looks for all the world like it's the Antichrist's arm, but in fact it's the devil's. That hits very well, catches very well how this dynamic unfolds. So to say it's a diabolical masterpiece is not for a second to say that we weren't very involved in it, that human beings in their sinfulness were very involved. It's a both and, not an either or.
Why is it so important to recognize the devil's role in this abuse crisis? Why can't we just say, oh, it's just a bunch of wicked men? Why is his role significant?
Because we won't understand it and therefore be able to respond to it adequately unless we are fully honest about it. That's why we anticipate the end of the book, the way forward. A lot of it is a spiritual renewal of the church. It's not just let's get our legal situation in better shape. Let's just improve our psychological screening and formation. Again, as important as those are, I'm not gainsaying either one for one moment. Don't get me wrong, but that's not enough. That what's called for ultimately is a spiritual renewal, and an acknowledgement that we're involved in a struggle. Right, in a spiritual warfare. And I think that's key to understanding this crisis in its complexity.
So that was chapter 1, The Devil's Masterpiece. Chapter 2 is titled Light from Scripture. What can the Bible teach us in regards to this crisis?
And I think here, Brandon, a lot of people might be surprised how clear-eyed the Bible is about this problem. Now, it's complex. The Bible is deeply appreciative of the role of human sexuality. The Bible's not a puritanical text. I've said 1,000 times. It's not a dualistic text. From the very beginning, God created all things spiritual and material, found them all very good. And furthermore, go forth and multiply, right, is one of the great commands of the Bible. In fact, whenever the covenant gets ratified throughout the Old Testament, it's usually accompanied by this command. to go forth and multiply. Marriage, sexuality, family, the joy of sex, all of that is frankly celebrated by the Bible. It's part of God's great plan. Okay, now there's a shadow side because the Bible, as I say, is so clear-eyed about the myriad ways that we human beings tend to get off kilter, right? Well, sex and family and so on are so beautiful that when they get off kilter, they become deeply corrupt, right? And so we find that in the Bible. And this might surprise people, but walk your way through the Bible, Old Testament and New, you'll find lots of references to this problem. One that always comes to my mind because I develop it a bit in the book. It's such a clear, distant mirror, if I can use Barbara Tuchman's famous phrase, that we look at the story and we see ourselves, but a long, long time ago, the story of Eli the high priest and his sons Hophni and Phinehas, priests, right? And Hophni and Phinehas, deeply corrupt, both financially and sexually, abusing their people. Complaints are brought to Eli, the high priest. He pays lip service to it and urges the sons to, get it together, but they don't, and he doesn't follow up. And the result of this corruption, both the actual abuse and the overlooking of the abuse by an authority figure, Eli, the result is disaster for Israel. The loss of the ark, the loss of 30,000 soldiers, the loss of their political prestige, and the loss of life. Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli all are killed, right? Or the two sons are killed. Eli dies when he hears the news. Now, my point is that story should sound pretty familiar to us in the last 25 years, right? Bad priests abusing their people, complaints brought forward to authority figures who say nice things but don't do very much. The result, disaster for the new Israel that we call the church. So I talk about that story and a number of others too. And then Jesus, I culminate with the Lord Jesus himself and the importance of children for Jesus as signs of the kingdom. Jesus putting his arm, that beautiful image, around the little child. Unless you change and become like one of these, unless you welcome, he who welcomes him welcomes me and welcomes him who sent me, etc. That children who were kind of marginal figures in Old Testament or in biblical times are brought so central by Jesus. So anyway, I develop a number of these things in that chapter. And I think as I look at this issue and the treatment of it, I don't find that very often, the biblical light being shed. So I think that's a helpful, perspective.
So that's chapter number 2, Light from Scripture. Chapter number 3 is titled, We Have Been Here Before. What's your purpose in this chapter?
Yeah, I start there with, he's still alive, my old church history professor, Father Charlie Meyer, taught generations of Chicago priests, including my own generation. And Charlie was a brilliant guy and loved taking us through the glories of church history. But he also took a kind of, I think, devilish delight in also showing us a lot of the corruption in church history, the corrupt priests and monks and popes, etc. And as I say in the book, for a lot of us who were kind of novices at that time, there was a little bit shocking. We had perhaps a naive, somewhat romantic view of the church and all these glorious figures, but then to hear of the deep corruption, even on the part of church leaders. But what I argue there is that in a way it was a very good immunization, if you want, is I got immunized by Charlie Meyer against being too scandalized. That, all right, the church has had bad people, even in very high positions, who've done terrible things. But we've survived. And in fact, in many cases, the corruption called forth the renewal associated with the really great figures in church history. It's not to excuse the corruption for a second, but it's to show somehow in God's providence, as the bark of Peter makes its way through the stormy waters, it's got, a lot of ups and downs. And so it's not to marginalize or to minimize what's happening now by any means, but it's to put it in a wider context. I also spent a little bit of time there with the famous Peter Damian story from the 11th century. St. Peter Damian, right? Great hermit and mystic and scholar and so on. But Peter Damian is famous for raising his very eloquent and strong voice against precisely sexual corruption in the church and on the part of high church leaders who were taking advantage of seminary and young priests. And again, talk about a distant mirror. You say the McCarrick crisis from last summer. Look back over 1,000 years in history. You'll see a distant mirror of the same thing. So I think it's helpful just to see what the body of Christ has endured over the centuries and how, despite all that, we've managed to survive. That's an important lesson, I think.
So that's chapter 3. We have been here before. Chapter 4 is when I think your blood really starts flowing. You get really excited and passionate because this one's titled, Why Should We Stay? I mentioned earlier that statistic from the Gallup survey that said 37% of American Catholics are considering leaving. Why should they stay? Why should they not leave the church?
Because we got to treasure an earthen vessel. So I use the Pauline image there as my master metaphor. And how helpful that at the very beginning of the church, Paul gave us that metaphor. The earthen vessels are obvious. It's us, right? The church. We're flawed. We're fragile. We're very breakable. But strangely, in those earthen vessels, there is a treasure, and the treasure is Christ. And the church, despite its failures and its fragility and its flaws, has borne that treasure up and down the centuries. Now, where do you find it? Well, you find it in the scriptures that have been preserved and commented upon by the church. You find it in the liturgy of the church. You find it in the sacraments. You find it especially in the Eucharist. You find it in the lives of the saints. You find it in the great works of art the church has propagated and so on. In all these ways, the treasure is on display, and it's because of the treasure that we stay. What we should never do is say, oh, look at all these fragile, broken vessels. Well, yeah, from Paul's time on, we should expect a lot of broken, fragile vessels. But we don't stay because of the vessels. We stay because of the treasure. And I want people not to be so preoccupied with the fragility of the vessels that they overlook what's on offer and what is still on offer, which are all the things I mentioned, and more. And that's why I say there's never a good reason to leave the church. Well, they're all so corrupt. Everyone, it seems to be so. Yeah, but the Eucharist. Well, there's all these sins. Yeah, but Christ made available in the sacraments. Oh, these priests and bishops have been so. Yeah, but salvation offered. See, so the yeah, but there is the insistence upon the treasure that persists despite the fragility of the vessels.
All right, let's talk about the 5th and final chapter. This one is titled The Way Forward. And I know a lot of people getting this book are going to flip right to that chapter because they're going to say, okay, I'm with you. We should stay. Corrupt men in the church aren't good reasons to leave. But what do? We still got to do something to reform the church, to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again. What do you propose in this 5th and final chapter?
Well, Brandon, one thing I do there is to insist upon something that the church has done a great deal in terms of protocols and reforms and laws and so on. And I talk briefly, but I talk about the 2002 Dallas Accords, right? In the wake of the first wave of this great scandal, the church did respond with extraordinarily good and effective protocols. And I say that not just because I'm a Catholic bishop, but because you can prove it statistically that after 2002, when these protocols were in place, the number of abuse cases, fell off the table. And just analyze any of the statistics there of this thing peaking, in the 1970s, maybe early 1980s, trending downward, but then downward precipitously after 2002. So I think we have to give full credit to the Dallas Accords. I was a seminary rector, and so the Dallas Accords very much affected my work because we're screening candidates. Well, the background checks, and you're at the level of like FBI kind of background checks of these students, the psychological exams, the number of interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The institutional awareness of this problem, I would say, is so clear. I subscribe to the view, many have said this, but I don't know any institution in the world right now where children are safer from this point of view than the Catholic Church because of these protocols. So anyway, I spend a good deal of time insisting upon that. But I then add, and go back to the beginning of the book now, it's not just a matter of protocols, as indispensable as they are. It's also a matter of real spiritual reform. And I use kind of blunt, frank language first about the priesthood, that who can deny, and this is not a blanket condemnation, and the vast majority of priests are good and decent men and so on, but that there was some kind of rot in the priesthood that allowed this abuse to happen. And you can look at that in a number of levels, both the abuse itself, but also the kind of overlooking of the abuse or looking the other way, not taking it with sufficient seriousness. What was it in far too many priests and bishops that kind of allowed this thing to unfold? I make some suggestions there about how the priesthood has to be renewed. But also, and again, this is not to say, hey, we're all equally to blame. That's not the case. I'm not denying for a second how central the corruption of the clergy is here. But clergy don't come out of a vacuum, right? They come up out of a culture. They come up out of, in the vast majority of cases, Catholic families. Is there a need for the whole church to be renewed? Yeah, it seems to me. A rededication to prayer, a rededication to the sacraments, a rededication to life in Christ. Have we allowed ourselves as a church in its totality to drift away from Christ? And I think the answer there is clearly yes. So I make some more suggestions there about how the church as a whole should be spiritually renewed. So that's the way forward. It is laws and protocols, et cetera. But more deeply, this was the case when St. Francis called for reform, when St. Dominic called for reform, when Ignatius of Loyola called for reform. It's a spiritual renovation that matters above all.
Well, we're hoping that this new book, Letter to a Suffering Church, gets into the hands of millions of Catholics all over the country, Bishop. But if you could just say one thing to the Catholic Church in America, one rousing word when it comes to the sexual abuse crisis as a pastor, as a bishop, what one thing would you like to say to them?
I'd say stay and fight. And in fact, we were thinking about titles for the book. That was actually a title we thought about. Stay and fight. This is not the time to leave. So I understand the 37%. And again, I understand it. I get it. I'm not trying to undermine that point of view. I get it. But this is not the time to leave. It's the time precisely to stay and to fight for what's best and right in the church. I used the example, I think we did it in our video last summer of Lincoln. It was a great hero of mine. Where there were many people at the time of the Civil War, especially once the war got really dicey, and people were dying in their tens of thousands, who were saying, oh, come on, let's just get out of this thing. Let's end this goofy war and let the South have their way, and let's just end the fight. And Lincoln's genius, was to, despite all that opposition, despite the terrible quality of the struggle, to say, no, we have to hang in there and fight. Because he saw the institution of slavery as a fundamental undermining of the very nature of American democracy, in a way that this rot that's in the church is undermining what we're supposed to be. All right, fight it, stay, redouble efforts. This is not the time to leave, but to stay and fight. That'd be my last word to Catholics.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. You can get a free copy if you cover the shipping at wordonfireshow.com/letter. But more importantly, we're encouraging you, please invite your parish to get copies for everyone in your parish community. You can get them for just $1 a copy with free shipping. All profits from the sale of this book go to charities that serve people who have been sexually abused. So we think this project is just win-win-win all the way around. We want to help the church and we want to help the victims. So please get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. Well, that sound means it is time for a question from one of our listeners. And today we have a question from Bob, who lives in North Carolina, and he's asking about what the church teaches about revelation, whether it's something that happened once or something that's ongoing. So here's Bob's question.
Hey, Bishop Barron, this is Bob from North Carolina. Our parish here is currently doing the study guide for the Mass, and one of the things that it talked about when it pushed us back towards the Catechism was a term called amnesis, which I believe is something that is a Platonic from Plato type term. My question is, if we start with Plato and we learn from those things, and that grows into the Old Testament, and that leads to the New Testament. Does the church feel like we're really there yet, or are we continuing to evolve and still having things revealed to us even today? Thank you very much.
Good. That's a searching question. First, anamnesis, word meaning memory, it's a Greek term, obviously, but it's not derived so much from Plato's sense, which is it's used in an epistemological context for Plato, that when we come to know something, we're actually remembering, what we knew when we lived in the realm of the form. So they're not using it in that way. Biblically, it's much more of a Jewish term. And it's the idea of the recuperation of history is not just a distant recalling, but a real participation in. So just that clarification, the anamnesis in question is not Platonic, it's much more biblical. But to your point, has the church used Platonic philosophy? Yeah, read everybody from Justin Martyr through Augustine of Hippo, and you find a lot of our major players using Platonic philosophy to explicate Christian theology. Can we use Aristotle? Famously, Aquinas does. Can we use all kinds of other people, as John Henry Newman used Locke and Hume, etc.? Sure. That's the Catholic genius. It's part of the both and of faith and reason, but also the Newman idea of the development of doctrine. So it doesn't mean that new doctrines are coming. So revelation, in one very important sense, is closed. It ended with the last book of the New Testament. That's when formal revelation ended. We're not expecting anything new to come at that level. However, what was given to us is like a seed that's now going to grow into a great tree. It's like the beginning of a river that's now going to unfold. Part of that unfolding process is indeed the use of whatever cultural forms we might find expedient to that purpose. So that's part of the Catholic genius. We don't get new doctrines, but doctrine unfolds, and it can do so through the influence of philosophy and so on. That's a very, very quick answer to your question that requires really a whole course in fundamental theology.
Well, before we wrap up here, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about our new way of supporting the podcast through Patreon, and we have a lot of patrons who have joined and wanted to be a part of helping out this show. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to several patrons who have donated at significant levels. They include Eric Hansen, Jacqueline Yoder, James Siddlington, Jamie Capetta, John Brenton, John Mattini, Juan Solaris, Karen Perry, Mark Rogers, Matt Gamble. All of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. On behalf of Bishop Barron, the whole Word on Fire team, we're so grateful for your support in helping get this show out to more people. So to all of you and to all of our patrons, I wanted to just express thanks on this episode and all future episodes as well. Well, one final reminder here before we wrap up, get your copy of the new book. Again, it's called Letter to a Suffering Church by Bishop Barron. Just came out today. You can get your copy by visiting wordonfireshow.com/letter. Get one free copy for yourself, but then more importantly, share it with your pastor, share it with your parish staff, encourage them to get copies for your whole parish. You can get them for just $1 a copy plus free shipping. All of the proceeds go to support charities that minister to victims of sexual abuse. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show. Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. Joining us is the bishop in the Santa Barbara region of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, Bishop Barron. Good to be talking with you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to be on with you. How are the kids doing?
Oh, we're doing great. We just found out, I don't think we talked about it here in the show, we're expecting our 7th child in August, so that'll be the great tiebreaker. We got the 3 boys and the 3 girls.
Yeah. How about twins?
Well, ask my wife
One
about
of each.
How exciting that would be.
One of each. That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. Now, let's catch up a little bit. We just last episode talked about your trip home for Christmas and the bishop's retreat. We're recording this here in early January, and you got a couple of things coming up in the next week or two. The next week is an event I think we've talked a little bit about. You're going to the headquarters of Amazon. Give us a quick reminder what that's about.
Yeah, I've been to Facebook and to Google, so Amazon invited me to come up and talk about the new book, Arguing Religion, in a kind of fishbowl setting. So I guess I'll be on a stage with an interlocutor who asks me questions about the book, and then we open it up to the crowd that's there. So I was delighted, more than happy to do it. I've always loved Seattle, and of course, Amazon is one of the great formators of culture today. So happy to do that. And then the second thing coming up is the following week, isn't it? Is World Youth Day, which I wasn't planning on going to, frankly. And then I got invited just maybe about a month ago to give a talk at the final, I think it's a big benediction, and Eucharistic procession within the arena for the English speakers, which I did in Krakow back in 2016, the same thing. So I thought, oh, how can I pass that up? So I said yes to that. So those are two things coming up shortly.
Where's the World Youth Day again this year?
It's in Panama City.
Panama.
So I've never been there before. And that's another reason I was kind of eager to go.
Okay, well, last week we sort of fisted an article from the New York Times. It was an op-ed by Ross Douthat called The Return of Paganism. There's another New York Times op-ed that I've seen floating around social media and all sorts of websites, getting a lot of traction, and I wanted to talk through this one with you. This
Sure.
one is by David Brooks. I think he's Jewish. He wrote one of my favorite books of all time called The Road to Character, kind of like these short moral biographies. But this op-ed that he wrote just last week is titled The Morality of Selfism, subtitle The Gospel of Saint You, Y-O-U, The Gospel of Saint You. And it's a bit satirical, tongue-in-cheek type of thing, but he's basically critiquing this culture of selfism. And here's how he begins. He says, "We live in a culture of selfism, a culture that puts tremendous emphasis on self, on self-care, on self-display. And one of the things we've discovered is that you can be a very good person while only thinking about yourself. Back in the old days, people thought morality was about living up to some external standard of moral excellence. Abraham Lincoln tried to live a life of honesty and courage. Mother Teresa tried to live up to a standard of selfless love. But not any longer today." What do you make of that assessment?
Well, there's a lot to it. I've admired his work too for a long time, and he's speaking for this classical moral tradition, and he thinks that we've fallen away from it. And I think he's dead right about that. I've used as sort of a motto for many years. Your life is not about you. Is a great, I think, biblical principle. It's your life, but it's not about you. In other words, the care of yourself is not your primary motivation. In fact, there's something childish about that. A little baby, certainly, and then even a toddler, a little kid, is self-preoccupied. Taking care of his or her needs is what it's all about. And the child naturally and appropriately expects those needs to be met by parents and everybody else. And the key to life now, the key to real maturity and joy is to break out of that. Hence the initiation rituals of most primal peoples around the world. The fact that we've lost that is a very telling thing in itself. One of the primary points of those rituals is to break you free of that, which is why they're so tough. Why they involve separation and scarification and physical assault in many ways. That you're wounded, you're marked, you're forced to do difficult things because they're trying to break you out of the self-regarding attitude of a child into the, I would call it, value-regarding attitude of the mature person. When you've intuited, I'm using Dietrich von Hildebrand's language, you've intuited certain objective moral values that now ought to govern your life and demand of you sacrifice for them. When you realize, depending on your culture maybe, but that your country or your city or your family is more important than you, when you realize the call to courage or to prudence or to justice is more important than your private concerns, now you're ready to live. Now you're ready to move into a mature spiritual space. So as I read Brooks there, that's what he's trying to recover, is that very ancient transcultural conviction that selfism is childish. It's the moral attitude of the toddler. And if that becomes a general cultural attitude, we're in some serious trouble.
Okay, let's continue. Again, he's writing satirically. This is not what he's actually arguing,
Yeah.
kind of the opposite. So he says there are two big problems with these external moral standards of trying to conform your life to something else beyond you. First is that this is actually harmful. And when people hold up external standards of moral excellence, they make you feel judged. These people make you feel sad because you may not live up to the standard. It's very cruel of them to make you feel troubled in this way. So when someone does this, you should just say, hey, that makes me feel judged, and then just walk away. Don't stoop to their level. What do you think about that?
I say boo-hoo. I say that's the attitude of a child. That's the attitude of a pre-adolescent, that my feelings of being hurt are what matters most. Come on. I mean, anyone who's morally serious is going to be hurt and judged. And again, that's that point in the initiation rituals. If life hasn't done it yet, we'll do it to you right now. We'll hurt you right now to remind you that life is hard and life is demanding. God help us if we take as our moral absolute, I shouldn't be harmed. Well, then you're going to live permanently in a playpen. You'll live permanently in a little room for the toddlers. And also, maybe we'll get to this, Brandon, but you'll fight like toddlers. I mean, you know all about little kids. How do little kids relate to each other? Because they're all living in that same self-absorbed space. Watch how toddlers fight. That's how many people today are fighting all the time. So I say boo-hoo to that. I mean, of course life hurts. Life is painful. Of course you're being judged. Good. You should be judged. But that means that you've broken out of your self-regard and you're actually in relation to values that matter. And of course they're going to judge you. Of course we're all going to be morally inadequate. Good. That means we're starting to live life in a morally serious way. See, to be under the judgment of God, it's a very interesting category. If we simply psychologize that as, oh gosh, I feel bad because this tyrannical parent in the sky is coming down hard on me, that's totally missing the point. To be under the judgment of God is to be actually in a mature and liberated space, because now I'm realizing my life is not about me, and I'm being called into high adventure. See, now read our friends Tolkien and company. These great stories of the hobbits breaking out of their little space and going on high adventure. What if Bilbo and Frodo just said, "Oh no, I don't want to experience any pain. I don't want to experience any discomfort." See, a big part of that story is when they're forced through discomfort. Even something in the beginning as simple as, I don't think we're going to get our second breakfast. Well, you'll be lucky to get your first breakfast, pal. But that's the point, is they're being taken out of the nursery and brought now into a serious moral space. If all we're worried about is, oh my gosh, I won't get my second breakfast, or oh my gosh, you're going to hurt my feelings, well, grow up.
All right, Brooks continues, again satirically. The second problem with these external moral standards is that they're very hard to relate to. People are always talking about how Nelson Mandela came out of prison and tried to usher in an era of forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, that's all very good and well for Nelson Mandela, but what does this have to do with your life? If people are talking to you, shouldn't they be focusing their attention on your life? Shouldn't they be saying things you can relate to? If somebody starts talking about some grand hero who is dead and lives far away, you should just respond, sorry, that's not relatable. These people have to learn how to keep things real.
Of course, but what they want there is to keep things deeply unreal. Go back to the initiation rituals again. So the scarification and the physical marking is a big part of it. But also the introduction of a young person into the lore of the tribe. And that's, again, transcultural. So take the young man, for example, out of his domestic space, scarify him, mark him, and then begin to tell him the stories of the great heroes. Who are the people that formed this tribe? Maybe those who, by a great heroic act, setting out into the forest or into the tundra, whatever your geography happens to be, and undertaking great adventures and enduring great dangers, they establish this community. You tell that story to inspire these young people to do something similar, So heck, the story of Mandela and how telling that is, because someone who, for the sake of justice, was willing to endure, what was it, 28 years or something of, I mean, staggering to think about, of imprisonment. Many of those years, I think, in solitary confinement. And then to come out of that experience the way he did, full not of anger and bitterness, but of a desire to build a new society. I mean, that's a classic hero's tale. Yeah, tell that to young people. Yes, encourage them to walk a similar path. I mean, to say that that's alien to them, no, that's their pattern. Are they judged by it? Yeah, sure they are. Good. Boo-hoo if you're feeling judged by it. Grow up. The Mother Teresa story, tell that to a young Catholic kid about this lady who, in many different ways, left her safe spaces, right, and took on ever greater moral and spiritual hardship and endured great suffering to come to this high spiritual attainment. That's a great story to tell people. I don't know how that's alien to anybody. Your life isn't about you, and the heroes help us to see that.
Brooks continues, and here he puts his finger on something I think really perceptive. He says, satirically, the good news is that these days we don't base our values on moral excellence, as the ancients might. They might have said the goal of life is to be virtuous, to be good. He said, instead, today we base our lives on meaning. People are always saying they want to lead a meaningful life. They want to do things that have meaning. But, Brooks says, one great thing about meaning is it's all about the emotions that you yourself already have. We say that an experience has meaning when that tingly, meaningful feeling wells up inside. Picture yourself, he says, shopping at a farmer's market where everything's locally grown. Do you feel the tingly, meaningful feeling welling up inside? Of course you do. The other great thing about meaning is that everybody gets to define meaning in his or her own way. You don't have to read a lot of thick books or have hard emotional or hard experiences to feel meaning. Just do things that give you good feelings. Does that seem like a pretty accurate assessment of today's culture?
Yeah, it does. The whole feelings thing, I've been on this kick for a long time because much of my life has been lived during this, I call it romantic period, sort of neo-romanticism, where we so elevate feeling. Just think for a second, you're watching a movie or listening to a song or talking to people. What's of higher value to them, heart or head? Ideas or feelings? And I mean, we all know automatically, of course, the heart's more important.
Follow your heart. Follow your heart.
Yeah. Of course, your feelings are more important than your intellect. But see, the overwhelming majority of human beings across the centuries would never have agreed to that. In fact, it's the disciplining of feeling that's key to emotional and spiritual maturity. Again, initiation rituals. I don't like being sent out into the woods with a few simple provisions and maybe a simple weapon to defend myself. I'm going to be cold. I'm going to be hungry. I'm going to be uncomfortable. I don't like this. Well, that's the point, kiddo. Their elders would say, that's the point. So that you can learn how to discipline your feelings so as to do the right thing. Because the right thing doesn't always feel good. In fact, it typically doesn't. Now, nuance that a little bit. Can you train your feelings so that you do get, if you want to put it that way, the tingly feeling when you're doing the right thing? Yeah, Aristotle would have called that habituation to virtue, right? By the right habituation, you become more adept at doing the right thing. It agrees with you to do the right thing. That means you're becoming a virtuous person. Good. Nothing wrong with feelings, but the idea is to bring the feelings under the aegis of the moral enterprise, not vice versa. If the feelings come to dominate, now go to Plato's great image, of the chariot and the charioteer, right? Reason that is directing the chariot, and the horses stand for the spirited emotion and for these animal emotions. Good. If they're under the guidance of reason, then they can power the soul. Terrific. The problem comes when the horses rebel against the charioteer, kick him out, and now the horses run wild. What's going to happen? You'll get nowhere. I would say, not just intellect here, I'd say when moral seriousness is running the chariot, now used your feelings properly trained, like properly trained horses, and man, they're going to power that chariot. You're going to make real progress. But don't kick the charioteer out in the name of emotional freedom, which in fact is going to lead you to disaster. So I think that's dead right. That's a real problem. If we think we're governed by our tingly feelings, I mean, God help us.
All right, David Brooks continues, if the cardinal virtue of this culture of selfism is meaning, finding meaning, how do we do it? And so he shares a 4-stage process for finding meaning today. And let's briefly talk through each one of these. So number 1, first, you want to feel indignant all the time. Back in the old days, morality was all about loving and serving others, but now it's about displaying indignation about things that other people are doing wrong. When you are indignant, he says, or woke, to use today's parlance, you are showing that you have a superior moral awareness. You don't actually have to do anything. Your indignation is itself a sign of your own goodness. And if you can be indignant quicker than the people around you, that just shows how much more good you are.
Yeah. No, the test, because there's nothing wrong with moral indignation. Think of the great Hebrew prophets, right? Think of Jesus cleansing the temple or calling the Pharisees, whitewashed sepulchres. Nothing wrong with moral indignation, but the test is, are you yourself actively engaged in fighting the evil that you're noticing? I will have much more confidence in Mother Teresa's moral indignation than I will in some kid sitting in a dorm room in college, just trying to signal his own virtue. Let the prophetic indignation arise from your own deep commitment. Then sure, I'll take that seriously. And I'll even acknowledge moral indignation to be part of a mature moral perspective. But yeah, the whole woke thing and virtue signaling, which I think is deeply annoying, and doesn't help. How many people are really stirred to help the poor when someone from their kind of moral high horse condemns them while they're sitting in their college dorm room? I mean, I'd say very, very few. Mother Teresa, off you go, and I think she'll have a far greater impact on actually changing people.
All right, so that's step 1 to find meaning, feel indignant. Here's step 2. Second, you want to make yourself heard. You want to put up a lawn sign that says, hate is not welcome here, or wear a t-shirt that says, stop the violence. By putting up a lawn sign that everyone else in your neighborhood already has, or wearing that t-shirt that all of your friends already wear, you are taking a stand and displaying who you are. You're showing the people who are trying to silence you that you are not going to stay silent. You're going to wear your fashion item whether they like it or not.
Yeah, I say do it, don't say it. In other words, the moral life's about action. Show me action. So you're against violence. Okay, good. Do what Gandhi did. Do what King did. You're for helping the poor. Go to Calcutta. Mother Teresa's sisters take volunteers all the time. Or go to your local Catholic charities in your city. Do something. Don't just signal virtue with a stupid T-shirt, but actually do it. So again, I'm being a little bit negative here. I mean, I go back to what I said last week is you can find traction. So if you got a young person who's wearing a T-shirt saying "Stop violence," great. I'm against violence. I honor the crucified God who took on the violence of the world and took it away through the divine love. Good. I'm against violence too, but maybe work with that and say, get involved in nonviolence, or hey, I'm for helping the poor. Terrific. There's all kinds of concrete ways you can do it. Do it rather than talk about it.
All right, here's the third stage. Again, satirical. The third thing you want to do is to tell your story. It wasn't easy to come up with feelings as good as your feelings. You had to go through a lot. So you want to inspire others by sharing about yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is talk about yourself a lot. Sometimes you have to keep talking about yourself, even though other people, selfishly, keep interrupting and trying to talk about themselves.
Yeah, it happens all the time, doesn't it? Do some of the saints write autobiographies? Yes. Think of Ignatius of Loyola. Think of Teresa of Avila. Think of Augustine. I mean, so I get that. A great saint can tell his or her story. But again, see, I think, and again, those are great saints who were walking the walk, as they say, as well as talking the talk. I would rather say, find a great story that's beyond yours. Find a story that is saintly and compelling, and try to conform yourself to the contours of that story. Because there's always the danger of just prideful self-advertising, as I tell my own story. No, say I'm devoted to this saint. I'll put it in a Catholic perspective. That means I find that story really compelling. And that's the whole initiation ritual thing. It wasn't, hey, let's get these young people together around the campfire and tell their personal stories. I mean, ho hum. They probably say, no, let me tell you these great stories of your ancestors that you should try to emulate. So I think that's a better way to grow in virtue.
I'm thinking here, I was just at the extraordinary Focus Seek conference, 17,000 young people, deeply encouraging, an amazing conference. But we had our Word on Fire booth, and one of the best selling things at our booth were these T-shirts we've made that say, your life is not about you.
Oh, good.
And it has a picture of Maximilian Kolbe on it. And that's immediately what I think of. Tell his story, conform your life to the way that he served at the end of his.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the saints. That's one of our great principles at Word on Fire, the saints. And I got that from von Balthasar and many others, that the great theologians are the saints. And that's part of an initiation ritual, is to be drawn into these great stories. I'm all in favor of stories, but I think your own tends to be kind of boring.
All right, let's bring it to a close here. So this is the end of David Brooks's article, New York Times, satirical, The Fourth Stage to Finding Meaning in This Culture of Selfism. The fourth thing you need to do is to condemn bad people. If somebody says something new or bad, you need to get on your phone right away. You need to tap the parts of the screen that will make it obvious that you are the sort of person who will not stand for bad people saying bad things. This isn't easy because your phone is low on battery power, but you still need to show up. You need to protect people from hearing ideas they may not already have.
Yeah, and that's certainly a phenomenon, isn't it? Partially the virtue signaling. I would just say, get in the fight. Don't talk about it or signal your virtue in regard to it. Get into the fight. I'm reading this new biography of Churchill. It's about 1,000 pages, but it's a one volume, which is, for Churchill biographies, is actually kind of short. It's 1,000 pages. But Churchill is such a fascinating life, and a guy with lots of ups and downs, and lots of light and dark in his character and all of that stuff. But Churchill belonged to a different time and generation, and I think there's no question he was a man of a big ego, for sure, but who knew he belonged to something bigger than himself, and believed in walking the walk. Remember, early in his career, he's First Lord of the Admiralty, so head of the British Navy during World War I, and he supervises and really advocates for the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles campaign, and look at the book for details. But it turns out to be a disaster. Hundreds of thousands were killed. The objective was not realized, and eventually the British Army and Navy just retreated. It was a disaster from any standpoint. And Churchill resigned his office, and he didn't write angry articles and blame. He felt some people had mistreated him, but what he did was he said, I'm going to go join my regiment. And so he was trained as a soldier, and he actually belonged to a regiment. So sure enough, off he went to France, and in the trenches with mud and rats and the dead all around him, he fought. He got back into the war, and he was, a high-level cabinet officer in the British government. But he said, no, time for me to get into the fight. And, by God, he did. And so that to me is kind of an inspiring thing, not so much virtue signaling or let me point out how wrong everybody is, but all right, time for me to just get in the battle and fight. I say to people, do that. So there are lots of battles, for sure. There are a lot of bad people doing bad things, for sure. Okay, get in the fight. Quietly, unobtrusively. Don't advertise what you're doing, but just get in there. Mother Teresa, I'm just going to go into the streets of Calcutta and begin caring for the poorest of the poor. Okay, do it. I think that's far better than all the T-shirt wearing and phone calling and virtue signaling and look at me and let me tell you my story. ho hum. Your life isn't about you. It's about surrendering to these transcendent values and then doing it. Get into the trenches and fight.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. We love hearing from all of you who listen to the show. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, visit askbishopbarron.com. Record your question, send it in. We would love to hear it. Today we have a question from Dan here in my state of Florida. He's wondering whether it's helpful or distracting that we Catholics seem to have lots of ways of describing God. So here's Dan's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. It's Dan from Pensacola. My question is whether or not, as an evangelist, you think it's helpful that we have so many definitions of God in the Catholic tradition. For me, I think it's wonderful that we can say God is who is, or God is love, or God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, etc. But for the nun or for the non-believer, I think we can sometimes leave the impression we're shifting the goalposts. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think it's shifting the goalposts. I think all those things you mentioned are different ways of saying the same thing. So they're illuminating the central mystery of God's way of being from different perspectives. And probably because the questions that were posed were different, the audiences were different, the concerns were different. And so you might articulate it in one way or the other, but all of them are saying the same thing. We're not describing different gods or not playing different language games, but illuminating the same reality from different perspectives. One thing I feel strongly about is the evangelist has got to be kind of light on his feet, meaning he's got to be able to adjust and he's got to be nimble. So you're talking to a person. What's on that person's mind? What's their background? What are they interested in? Your strategy will change depending on that. Boy, that argument, that really worked with this guy. It might mean nothing to this gal over here. Can you draw from the great tradition these different ideas, systems, forms of theology? Yeah, and it depends on the situation you're in. I would tell my students when I used to teach at Mundelein that they're like doctors with these little, your medical case, and you have a lot of different medicines in there and a lot of different, antidotes and so on, because you don't know what you're going to face. And if you approach every illness with the same strategy, well, you're going to be pretty ineffective. So I would say learn all those ways of talking about God. Think of Anselm's, that than which something greater can be thought. Aquinas, the one in whom essence and existence coincide. The Bible, I am who I am, or God is love. I mean, all those are describing the same reality, but with different rhetorical purposes, different audiences in mind. And I would say have them all at your fingertips so you can use what works in a given situation.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show. Couple quick things. One, if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, you might be excited to know that we've now started producing most of these episodes on video. You will find them on Bishop Barron's YouTube channel. You can also find them on Bishop Barron's Facebook page. Second, if you could take a few seconds and leave a review on iTunes or another podcasting service, that would be super helpful. It takes you just a few seconds, but it really helps get the show out to many more people. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.